the government has just announced changes to support the community housing providers.
This is an announcement from Minister Chris Bishop, and that's where he said we're going to create a level playing field. We're going to put the community housing providers at the same level as Kainga Ora. There's a review being done by Sir Bill English, former Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance for many years, into Kainga Ora and their operations, their efficiency. Unfortunately, it's widely perceived as being grossly inefficient.
We've got David Whitburn back again, and we're going to be talking about some community housing providers. And if you've got an investment property and you're looking at options at renting it out to either a private renter, social housing, community housing, it's good to know what your options are. So David's the former president of the Auckland Property Investors Association. He's got a bunch of rental properties. We're going to talk about community housing. So, firstly, what is community housing?
Community housing is housing for some vulnerable people there that are on lower incomes that may not be able to get onto qualify for private housing rentals. They'll be on a public register because of their incomes, and this will mean that they're able to get an income-related rent subsidy, or IRS. And this is where community housing providers since 2014 have been able to access this, just like Housing New Zealand, which that lately got renamed Kainga Ora.
Yeah. And so is community housing not-for-profit? Is it for-profit? Is it charity? Is it...
Yeah, sure. The community housing providers must be not-for-profit, so they are typically structured as charitable trusts, but not exclusively so. There are around about 100 community housing providers across the country. Many of them are pretty small, but there are some sort of the top 6 of them are actually really, really significant players in it. In aggregate, they've got nearly 20,000 homes. In aggregate, they've got nearly 20,000 tenancies. So it's a significant portion of them. But still, Kainga Ora vastly exceed that with over 70,000.
Yep. So what are the examples of the largest community housing providers?
Ones like Accessible Properties, NZ's a really large one. There's things like Strive Community Trust, the Salvation Army, Monte Cecilia Trust, John Tamahiri's Te Whanau Waipareira Trust, another significant provider, and numerous other ones, Habitat for Humanity and the like.
So there's a lot of iwi-backed trusts,
church-based trusts as well that are active in the sector. Many have done this for countless decades as well, prior to these schemes being available, and certainly before the income-related rent subsidy was made available to them. So a lot of them have been able to run off the sniff of an oily rag.
Yeah, and it's a lot of volunteers helping out. So what?
Absolutely.
What are the benefits of community housing versus, say, Kainga Ora?
Sure. Kainga Ora is the government. It's an absolutely big beast. It unfortunately has come under a lot of scrutiny for being woeful or inept, as many have said, for evicting tenants, because unfortunately some of these tenants are a bit more vulnerable, and some of them do like to play music at 4 a.m. at night and party and drink, throw nappies, dirty nappies over the fence and things like that, which is a really real shame there. It's just that when you think about it, the 99% plus of tenants are actually really good and are not that antisocial, but it's that sub 1% that are an absolute disaster. And Kainga Ora is not so good at managing those ones there. They feel terrible at evicting them. So it's quite inefficient in that they have a lot of properties that they build. They do tend to build them overvalue, spend huge sums of money for doing it. In recent years, it's been a bit of a bottomless pit, whereas the community housing providers tend to be a lot more efficient and prudent governors of money. They don't have the open checkbooks that Kainga Ora have, or at least have had in the past. So they're widely seen, and in my opinion, are lean, mean fighting machines that are out there trying to help provide shelter for the nation's most vulnerable people.
Yep. I see from this community housing organization, we're looking at things like affordable housing, public housing, emergency housing, transitional housing, progressive home ownership, like rent to buy, shared equity. There's a lot of different variations.
There are different variations. There a couple of those ones you mentioned, like emergency housing, that often came into play with things like Fenton Street and Rotorua, getting under a lot of criticism there. This is only meant to be short term, so 3 months maximum kind of thing. So this is where perhaps there's a relationship, a battered woman or person in a relationship that's needs to get out and have a place to stay. So that there is some grounds for doing that. Quite a few people, if there are no family members around and someone's just released from prison, where are they going to go? So how do we make sure that we get people transitioned into housing? There's a space for transitional housing where people don't have a place to live. We don't want, in my worldview, I don't want to have our nation's most vulnerable people living rough under bridges and in parks and streets there as well. I think we can do better than that and wrap around a few social services for doing this.
Yeah.
So there at one extreme, the emergency housing's at one far extreme, then a little bit of a higher independence, and that would be the transitional housing. These areas are getting have had some massive funding cutbacks on it, and then things like the, I guess, affordable home ownership and progressive home ownership pathways, where there's a path perhaps that can own 65% or something like that now, and then graduate up to 100% ownership in the years ahead.
Yep.
Those things can be saluted too. I've done rent to buy schemes in the past for tenants that haven't had deposits there, and they've been able to convert every single one of them to make them homeowners. So that's actually a really good, rewarding way to do it. People feel more involved in their community, able to build a bit more wealth, and have that luxury of not being able to be kicked out by their landlord, by having access to a stable tenancy in a warm, healthy, dry home. So I think that that community housing is a fantastic way of doing that, particularly some of those pathways. It's just perhaps we could improve it by not necessarily creating dependency for that, because otherwise it can remove disincentives to work, which unfortunately can lower our overall productivity and cause a burden on the taxpayers for the ever-increasing subsidies.
Yeah. So if you're an investor, you own rental property and you're considering community housing, how do you go about it?
Yeah, sure. You'd catch up with the community housing provider, and I've done that with a few properties in my portfolio, and you can get a lease from them. So in many cases, it's often a new build, but potentially it might be an older place. You certainly must comply with the healthy home standards to make sure that everything's functional and fit for purpose, and they may well have demand on their lists that they cannot satisfy otherwise. So it can be a great way to do it. You can get a long-term lease. It is at market value, and you can negotiate clauses and make good and things like that if you're a little bit worried about damage to it. But I would encourage some private landlords to consider social housing for doing this. Part of it can be, if you're minded that way as well, it can actually be a way to help provide for some more vulnerable people.
Yep. And so the government has just announced changes to support the community housing providers. Now, what are we looking at?
Absolutely. This is an announcement from Minister Chris Bishop, and that's where he said we're going to create a level playing field. We're going to put the community housing providers at the same level as Kainga Ora. There's a review being done by Sir Bill English, former Prime Minister and indeed Minister of Finance for many years, into Kainga Ora and their operations, their efficiency. Unfortunately, it's widely perceived as being grossly inefficient and has not been managing costs very well, and has actually caused a debts burden. It's costing the government a lot of money, whereas it used to always pay dividends from its 70-odd thousand stock of houses. So
yeah,
this one's...
I saw, is it Kieran McAnulty was criticising national government for taking, last time they were in power, 500 plus million in dividends from Kainga Ora. And, now obviously that's Kainga Ora being a money pit.
It's costing over a couple of billion a year. It's just, is that a big dividend to get when I believe they had certainly well over 60,000 homes? Is that a big dividend to get 500 million across?
Probably
that?
Not, right?
It's a pretty poor yield to me for that. I think that the aggregate value of the houses represents a sub 1% yield on that. So I wouldn't suggest that that's an extreme dividend. It's all of it. But the reality is, Kieran McAnulty did make the point that we don't have as many, public housing or social housing places as other countries in the world. So potentially there is some room to improve in that. And so therefore it comes down to Chris Bishop's announcement of how do we increase that housing stock? And the way is by having the community housing providers, or CHIPs, to have the same funding, continue to have the availability of the income-related rent subsidies, but also the ability to do leases. So they perhaps can do 10 or 15-year leases and have the funding from the Community Housing Regulatory Authority to enable the community housing providers, like some of those that we listed, to offer long-term leases to investors to tie up their capital for that in exchange for having a guaranteed rent for a longer term. And if the leases are at least 10 years, I think that's something that'll get good finance on.
Yeah. So, community housing for an investor is definitely something to look at, especially if you're struggling to rent out your property, because you get an annual lease. So you get your 52 weeks of rent instead of the volatility.
Absolutely.
It puts a property manager from the community housing provider, to be accountable for the tenants.
Yes.
And you get a make good clause, any damages from
by the tenant to do it. Yep, absolutely. That's something that you can negotiate as well.
Yep, and you are helping the community. Yeah,
absolutely. We do, in my worldview, have a duty to make sure that we look after the most vulnerable people. It's a fundamental human need to have shelter, and it's a high portion of outgoing income as well. So some people have slipped through the cracks through our education system and not picked up an undiagnosed mental health issue. So in many cases, we need to just give these people a little bit of a hand up and get that support. So it's a way of providing and fulfilling a really good duty to look after these fantastic Kiwis that need that helping hand. And it's one that you can actually do while making a little bit of money out of it the same way to get a win-win outcome.
Yep, and you've been talking to some of the community leaders and church leaders about their options?
Yes, absolutely. And I think there are many churches that have some big land. Instead of perhaps mowing lawns for Jesus or having those oversized car parks, they can actually utilise their land a little bit bigger. Certainly not graveyards though, but many churches do have some quite large land holdings in good locations from their forefathers' visions in the decades and centuries prior. So it's something there that I'm passionate about, and I do support through my Abide Charitable Trust churches and not-for-profits to utilise their land a little bit better, so give them some strategies and a pathway for developing to extract perhaps a way that can ease their burden on tithings and donations and such like, to make sure that they are sustainable going forwards. And this way it's a win-win there, and they can actually often provide the pastoral care and some of the araha and or love that can be lacking.
Yep. And what about on Maori and iwi land? There's obviously some success in that space already. You can see that there'll be a lot more effort put into it.
Absolutely. There are many varied and wonderful iwi providers too. The likes of Kainga housing, which are done on marae, is something that I think is a really good way to use this. As the times rolled on, most Maori do not live on marae. They are often in urban centres too. So by being able to have marae to do this and utilise their land, sometimes to have housing for their kaumatu or elders, I think it tends to be a really good way to access that. We see that at Te Mahure Marae in Point Chevalier. The Kainga housing there is a fantastic project, and many of the iwi-run community trusts are doing a really, really good, solid job for doing that. They're actually open to people that are on the public register, so for all races, creeds, ethnicities and genders, so it's rather than only for Maori as well. So I think that's an important thing to note, and they certainly acknowledged as providing a lot of great leadership in this space.
Yeah, so if you're an investor, have a look at the social housing, community housing options, and if you're looking at getting yourself into a house and you're struggling yourself, you can register in the community housing side and investigate options.
Absolutely, and there'll be further detail that gets released from Minister Bishop early in the new year as well, in terms of the exact details of the funding. So at this stage, it's an announcement, but it's certainly an announcement that moves in the right direction, and there'll be some actual detail that comes through this shortly. Yeah, exciting.
And I'm fully supportive of taking money from an inefficient body like Kainga Ora. It's proven to be inefficient, and putting it into community housing on the front line where there's community leaders, often volunteers. They're working, they have a charitable mindset, and they're going to be putting that money to much better use, into the front line.
Absolutely.
So thanks, David.
Thanks, Andrew.
Any questions about community housing, leave them below, and don't forget to like and subscribe.